Welcome back to another episode of Profitless on Purpose, the podcast that looks at all things nonprofit from an accountant's perspective. I'm one of your hosts, AJ Wheeler, and with me this week, as always, is Mark Palardy.
Hey, everyone.
And Tammy Hess.
Guys.
So this week we have a really great episode. Our first article is about how Warren Buffett just stepped down from his position with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and how that relates to your board. You know, succession planning, when is a good time to step down and when it's good to bring in new blood into your board of directors. We'll talk about it. Our next article is how engaged boards slow fundraising turnover, why your fundraising department needs board engagement and how that can help boost your fundraising. And then our last article is showing donors ROI. What's ROI in a nonprofit? Well, we'll define it as the article shows us, and then we'll talk about whether or not you should actually show it to your fundraising partners. So, and then lastly, our topic for discussion this week are the do's and don'ts of grant writing. What should you do? What shouldn't you do? How do you put together a grant proposal? Well, we'll talk about it in a roundtable discussion at the end. Anyway, Mark, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, you bet. I have an article. It's a little bit topical, but I thought it was interesting. Warren Buffett resigns from the Gates Foundation board, calling himself an inactive trustee. So the week that we're recording this, Warren Buffett decided that he is going to step down from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. He said, "For years, I've been a trustee, an inactive trustee, that only one recipient of my funds, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I am now resigning from that post, just as I have done with all other corporate boards other than Berkshire." He still says that his goals are 100% in sync with those of the foundation, and that his physical participation in no way reflects his leaving the board. At 91, I think it's, we don't really know the real reasons. A lot of people are speculating it's because of the shenanigans going on behind the scenes at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But my focus in bringing this to the table was I was just more curious between us as a board, if there is a good time to kind of exit out of the picture, not necessarily if there's a good age, because there's no ageist bias here, but I think this was a thoughtful decision on Warren Buffett's part and his participation. He still wants to give $4.1 billion to the organization. So he's certainly not shying away from that. But when we have big donors in nonprofits or, people who are active in other ways, not necessarily donations, do we look at an exit strategy and what does that look like for them? And I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Actually, this one, I think the real part that I honed in on the article was the fact that he called himself a non-participating or an inactive trustee, I guess is what he called himself. But I think what it brought to light to me is often, and his name has a lot of pull, if he's investing or, giving philanthropy to a certain organization, I think there's some like name cachet that goes along with that. And it's kind of prestigious to have, if you can say on our board, we have Warren Buffett, and there's probably local examples of, a local type of celebrity or philanthropist in your area that kind of shines and you wish you had them on your board. But what I think realistically, you want your board to be engaged. And I guess, you really want those board positions to be coveted to really spur forward the organization as a whole and the nonprofit mission and vision and their programs. And if you have somebody there, it's a double-edged sword, right? You want them to be giving the money and supporting the organization and the cause, but you want them involved. And in his words, he was an inactive trustee, which I think, said to me was that he was giving money, but he was not attending the meetings or involved in any kind of day-to-day or month-to-month board operations or trustee operations of the foundation. So I would say that is probably a good time to step down if you're just there as a check or, as a donor. I think there's other ways that you could recognize somebody, like through an award or through naming a program or a certain, especially if they're giving that much money, naming programs after them. There's ways to get that name recognition without necessarily having them in a trustee or a board position that requires more than just them signing a check. So I think for board, and I think it's an introspective thing too for board members to look at themselves and ask themselves, am I just giving money and on this for a prestigious kind of role, or am I adding, or could I still give that money and get that recognition and the pat on the back a different way without occupying a board role that somebody else that is, more of a go-getter or here and active would have a better impact on the mission, and my money would go further with somebody at the helm that would, be steering the ship instead of me just kind of writing a check and asleep at the wheel, I guess is the best way to say it. What did you think, Tammy?
Yeah, so I had a couple of thoughts in terms of succession planning or exit planning. I think that's a good thing for all boards and individuals to think about, because what could happen is you aren't planning for something and something dramatic happens. If you're a long kind of member of a board, that could really disrupt the flow of operations or, of the board members as a whole. So actively planning and talking about that and coming up with a strategy and an exit strategy, as well as just overall succession planning and keeping the board kind of mixed with people, is probably a really good thing for all boards to really consider. So they're not in reaction mode, but they're really in the proactive thinking. And that way you can set it up as a way to have a plan, like a strategic plan or succession plan, but a plan of what that looks like. So then it becomes more of a discussion of, am I an active member? Do I become an inactive member? Do I decide to do more of a slow withdrawal, phasing out? There's all these things that could come up in the discussion. But I think the key point is to have a discussion and a plan so that you're not caught off guard or you're having to react to it in lifetime, where it could actually be detrimental to the organization. So I'm assuming, based on this article, that this decision didn't come overnight, that it was a kind of a planned situation. And so the exit strategy was well defined and thought through. And that's what I think, it's a good role model to do that, because boards do need to think about that. And I think it's one of those things where a lot of times boards are trying to get board members on. And they want the legacy board members. And so you find people who have been on boards for, 10, 20 years or so. And the question does become, are you, kind of what AJ was saying, are you still a really active member? Are you helping the organization grow? Are you becoming kind of a preventative board member that's not allowing the organization to shift and change as it's needed? So I've always encouraged boards to think about succession planning and exit planning, not just, due to time or to age or to situations that happen, but to also think about the life of the board. And do you need more people in of different types of backgrounds or life experiences that you want to do that while maintaining a good size of the board. So just thinking about that whole board organization, membership kind of plate.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Tammy. And I think even in particular to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, it's going to be interesting to see what the succession planning is for the two main names of the foundation, right? You can't really plan for a divorce, and the full-time jobs of Bill and Melinda Gates for the past 10 years has been running the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and giving away their wealth. And so both have said they're interested in continuing this work, but with divorce, things can get sticky, and how they're going to work together, running this board is going to be an interesting thing to watch. I would love your comments on at Profitless Pod or in the notes here on the YouTube podcast, and let us know what you think about this kind of succession and exit planning. Tammy, I think you have another article for us.
I do. So mine's from Nonprofit Times, titled "Engaged Boards Can Slow Fundraiser Turnover." The article addresses how an engaged board can help reduce the high turnover amongst fundraising professionals. The challenge many nonprofits face is finding qualified candidates and retaining them, especially in the fundraising profession. According to a study that was recently done, 31% of fundraisers changed jobs due to a career or personal development. This included moving to a position with more responsibility, moving to a larger nonprofit, or to make more money. 27% of fundraisers left due to a lack of skills or their overall performance in the job, mostly citing that they fail to meet the fundraising goals. 19% of fundraisers left to dissatisfaction with the organization, where the organization wasn't providing enough support or they weren't feeling valued in their position. 11% of fundraisers left to interpersonal challenges with leaders of the organization or supervisors or even other team members. The study showed that fundraising had more success when there was more involvement at the leadership and board level. Less than 50% of the fundraisers surveyed stated that the leadership or the board were not even reasonably involved in fundraising efforts. While the article doesn't clearly assign the turnover challenge with a lack of involvement at the leadership or board level, it does suggest that it causes fundraisers a significant amount of concern. So I wanted to ask the group, what are your thoughts on the leadership or the board impact on the fundraising profession?
Yeah, I think it's kind of often a couple things on this. I think it shows there's a link between, kind of fundraising, and this is kind of foreshadowing what we'll talk about in our discussion topic, but how there's a relationship building that happens there between a fundraiser, whoever your frontline fundraisers are, and the donors. And they're going to give to people not only the causes that they hold close to their heart, but the fundraising staff that goes out there and engages them. And they're used to seeing them. They're used to that person being the person that they go to give their money to that organization. And there's a relationship that's built there, not just between the organization that they're donating to, but to the person that's representing the fundraising drive or the fundraising campaign that's around that. And I think it's true, if we're talking about let's talk about maybe a yearly gala. If somebody's been, kind of driving a yearly gala and it's been performing well, I think there's a relationship there between vendors, sponsors, the general public that's giving or donors. And the same thing holds true with grants. Although we think about grants, as separate from fundraising, sort of, there's often a relationship between the grantor or the foundation and the organization. If we were talking about county and city grants, you usually have a relationship with somebody at the county or city that would recommend you for that grant. So, or at least it makes it much easier to get that grant. So I think, that personability of your fundraising staff. The other thing that really stuck out to me was often if fundraising isn't going well, often, an organization needs a scapegoat. And usually that's the fundraising director or the fundraising staff. And if you let them go, okay, we're going to hire somebody better, or we're going to hire somebody that's more qualified. Well, you might want to step back and look to whether or not that fundraising staff and the fundraising, division of your organization has been given enough support to be able to accomplish the mission that you set forward for them. If they're not provided with, board support, like Tammy said, or organizational support and resource, support, then you've kind of set them up to fail. And even if you get somebody in there with better experience and better, kind of results somewhere else, if you don't give those same people the kind of resources and support that they need, they're bound to fail as well. So I think, taking a look at it holistically, of course, if somebody isn't doing their job or following up with donors or anything that, that they should be doing, or they lack the skills or oversold themselves on their resume and in the interviews, then I think, yeah, you probably do need to make a change. But you need to make a change, I think, that, because you're a public facing organization and those people are established with the fundraising that they are bringing in. If you're going to make a change, try to do it in a way that acknowledges the person and that they're leaving and kind of lets it write a story that you can tell donors that they'll still be taken care of and notified and still have that relationship with the organization. And it wasn't centered around just this one fundraising person that they were so comfortable with. What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, first of all, I'm going to acknowledge fundraising is tough, right? As an accountant, I have frequently said to boards that I've served on, I count the money, I don't raise the money, right? Because I don't particularly love doing the ask. While I want to participate as a board member and while I want to certainly contribute as I can, the process of fundraising is a difficult position to be in, and you're asking for money. And frankly, it rests on your shoulders as to whether the organization can continue to serve its mission, right? If the funds aren't coming in, the organization's not happening. So I think, as with for-profit companies, nonprofits and their boards, it all goes back to tone at the top, right? If you have a board that is engaged, believes in the mission, and helps foster and engage with the fundraising committee so that those people who are working in development can work closely with board members, because a lot of board members are people who have money and they have connections, and they're connecting you to other people. And if they see passion in an organization from a board member, their other wealthy friends or donors might be willing to contribute as well. And this is how an organization can grow fast, is when you have people at the top who are connected in that way, engaged. So I definitely agree with the nature of this article that an engaged board really can keep the fundraising engine going. And frankly, if you're working in a fundraising development department and you're successful, a rising tide lifts all boats. Those who might not have the experience or might not know as much when they're starting out, if the organization is successful, you're usually not culling people at that point anyway. And then they get experience from just being there year after year. And eventually they can take over the higher level positions, which this article also points to. So I think, a board that is fully engaged really does take it home. So AJ, I think you have another article for us.
I do. So sticking with the fundraising theme, this article is from the Nonprofit Hub, and it's titled "How Showing Donors the ROI Will Boost Your Fundraising." So my first question was, what's ROI for a nonprofit? Because usually we're used to hearing that for a for-profit, right? What's your return on investment? So they narrowly define it as this very kind of, I guess, ratio, because it is a ratio of fundraising cost over money raised. So essentially what it's asking you to do, and one thing that we've advocated on this show before, is having essentially a profit and loss related to your fundraising, and to be able to identify the fundraising costs in your organization. Now, with the update to the new nonprofit reporting standards, you actually have to run a functional expense. You're required to run a functional expense for all nonprofits. And part of that is breaking out programs, fundraising, and admin. Fundraising and admin kind of fall into indirect services. So essentially what the article is stating, and they kind of are alluding to, is if you show this ROI of fundraising cost over the dollars raised, and you're able to show them how much, the small amount of money, hopefully the small amount of money that you have put into the fundraising costs has generated so much money that this will increase your donations. And what I think the article alludes to, or what the article is kind of skirting around, is that old charity navigator ratio of admin to program costs, and how, there's 20% admin and 80% program costs. And that means that 20 cents of every dollar you donate is going to fund, evil admin or whatever it is. So I think it's giving an organization a way to spin that and to be able to share that information with their donors in a different way, where part of our admin costs is going towards raising funds that help support and generate programs and outcomes. And so I think the article says sharing that information, I think, would generate more donations, because it shows that you're using that money and you're using those resources wisely. I would kind of counter to the article in saying that, I think sharing your story, and I think if a donor is, so inclined that they want to see these kind of numbers, or comes at you with, an admin to program cost kind of calculation, and they're that savvy, that you could share something like this, but I don't necessarily know that I would want to share my fundraising ROI with everyone, especially if you have if you're a low fundraising kind of organization, say you work in like the low income housing credit markets, but you do have a fundraising portion that, is set out, and you don't return much on your fundraising. Would you really want to share this? But I'd like to get Tammy and Mark's, kind of take on this and see, maybe I'm way off base and we should all be sharing our fundraising ROI around.
Yeah. So I think it's knowing your audience. And we've said this many a times and in previous podcasts, but really knowing what your donors or potential donors want to know, because I always say, I love numbers. Numbers are fun. So throw me a good, metric and I can get all into that. And I love a good story. So I am the type of donor that likes the story with the numbers and trying to embed it both. But there are some people who run away from numbers and, you give them a bunch of data and a bunch of points and you start defining, ROIs and everything, and you lose them because they're like, I don't know what that means. I don't care about that necessarily. I want to know what the mission is. What's what is the story? How are you helping individuals? So I would always, kind of start with pulling your audience, understanding what kind of information they need, find a way, if you can, to embed that into a storytelling. So it's not just one or the other, it's a mixture of both, so that you can provide those folks who want to have the story, that they can have the story, but also support that story with some numbers, because a lot of people do rely on data and numbers to really get a sense of how an organization is doing, or if they want to invest and see what their return is on their investment in that type of nature. What about you, Mark?
Yeah, I really like this idea of metrics. I'm an accountant, so I like metrics, right? But I think this article brings to light some key performance indicators, KPIs, if you will, that you can use creatively in the nonprofit sphere. And one of the ones that they mentioned was number of beneficiaries served over a period of time for the program. And I think that correlates directly to what Tammy's talking about. That gives you both the combination of numbers, but it gives you the story as well, right? If I can come to somebody, let's use AJ's example of the housing, and say, we have served this year 500 people over the past year, or over the past 5 years, we were able to help 2,500 people. That has an impact. It's still a metric. And these kind of metrics can be, utilized and tweaked to fit your individual nonprofit, so that you can think, what is going to best show the work that we're doing when we're advertising, when we're fundraising? Some people will like an ROI and just know, this is how much that we're spending, on programs as a percentage of our whole dollars received. But some are really going to want to know the story while still having an analytical approach to that. Because, the problem that I see often is that you'll have somebody trying to get you to give money, and they'll give you the one anecdotal story. And I'm like, okay, well, you found one person who had a good experience, but that doesn't tell me the story of what's really going on in the whole organization.
And I'm going to add to that, because I think that what you could do is be flexible. So if you have the story and you're leading with the story, that's great. But be ready for the person that you're sharing the story with to ask those number questions. Because if you deliver this great message and this great story, and then they go, oh, well, by the way, what is your admin rate? Or, what is your ROI? And you just kind of stare at them back and don't have an answer, probably not the best approach too, right? So be prepared to be able to address those questions that come up, because sometimes they do come up, and you maybe misread the audience, and you're thinking, oh, they just want the story, and you may know the numbers, but you don't feel comfortable sharing them off the top of your head. Make sure that you have them kind of in your back pocket so that you can share those, so that you're prepared, and then the conversation can continue.
And Tammy, thanks for the intro to what I was going to say, because one of the big ways you're able to share your numbers if you have them bifurcated enough. So make sure that your fundraising and your message department is working with your accounting department, so that you're able to have that functional look at your programs, your admin, your fundraising, and be able to pull those numbers if needed to be able to provide the information needed to the audience that it's needed to. So that was a great discussion, actually. Mark, do you have our, speaking of discussion topics, do you have our discussion topic roundtable topic for the week?
You bet, AJ. I really think for the next few weeks, we want to get into some do's and don'ts around the nonprofit sphere. Everybody loves a listicle. And I think having some quick, punchy ways of thinking about things, especially on topics that we might have already discussed, might help you think around some of the ways to do things. So today's topic, I want to have a roundtable discussion on the do's and don'ts of grant writing. So what makes a successful grant fund? What are some things you should avoid? And, let's just go around and talk about some of our do's and tips and some of our don'ts, like maybe not. So Tammy, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I'll start off with a do. I strongly advise folks to read the application and the requirements before really starting what you're going to be doing, because I think sometimes you think, oh, I have an idea, I have all the stuff, I'm going to start my proposal, I'm going to start all my budgets and all of these things. And then when you actually go to the application or the proposal requirements of that particular grant, what you've done doesn't align to that, and then you have to start over, or you don't capture some of the key things that they're asking for. So my great do is, first step, read the application and read the documents that you are going to be engaging and looking into. AJ, you're next.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point that these grant applications are very time consuming. So I think allowing yourself enough time and having the resources available to go after these kind of grants is a big do. And the don't on the other side of that is trying to cram in a quick grant application. Be aware of timelines and deadlines that you have. So be aware of the time that it takes to submit a grant, and be aware of the grant deadlines. Often these are open, grant applications for a set amount of time. And you need to make sure that you can get all your ducks in a row, get that grant application together and looking sparkling clean, and get it submitted by the time it's done. So, kind of targeting the correct grant, allowing enough time for it, and having the correct people in place to be able to put that grant proposal together, because most often that grant application is a mix of not just financial information from the accounting department, but programmatic information that's needed from whoever's going to be running that program, or whoever's best suited to provide that information in a narrative form into the grant application itself. And just be aware, you won't just be talking about the program that you want to fund. You're going to have to talk about the entire organization and share financial information. So if you have any blemishes on your financials, you need to be able to explain that in a way that a grantor will understand. You're up next, Mark. What do you got?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of what you were saying. And I think getting buy-in from your institution or whatever your organization is, like, we're going for this grant for this particular purpose. You want to have it be aligned with your mission and vision, as we have discussed in previous podcasts. But you really also want to realize that these are going to be resources of women hours, to help contribute and get the grant funded. So you're going to want to get feedback from appropriate individuals like finance, the program department, stakeholders, maybe people who will be receiving the benefit of whatever grant you're going for, and making sure that you're really aligned with what the grant is that you're applying for, so that you don't get halfway through the grant process and your organization says, yeah, we don't want to focus on that right now, right? So really getting buy-in and knowing that you're in alignment with your organization is my next tip.
I would also say, really tell a compelling story. Tell the why, the how, and the why that the grantor needs to be a part of this particular program or fund that you're requesting, because telling that compelling story really does get people to want to engage in this in the organization. So really think about that. I'd be careful, and when you're developing the compelling story, not to do too many acronyms or catchy words or things of that. It's kind of goes back to know your audience. But sometimes if you use some terms or some jargons that people aren't familiar with, they get lost in that. And then you want to be concise in your proposal documents, but at the same time, you want to be able to tell a compelling story. So don't add a bunch of stuff that's not needed, but try to be concise and use the storytelling and the words that matter.
Those are great points. I wasn't even considering those. I thought when we were first talking about this topic off air, I was thinking of grant writers And so this is maybe a do and a don't. So if you're going to, often I used to work with organizations that are like, we need grants. Let's just hire a grant writer. And I think, this goes into a couple areas, but a grant writer, if you're going to hire a grant writer, it's because you don't have the capacity to actually physically write the grant. And you shouldn't hire a grant writer because you don't know how to you don't know how to write the grants or how to even start. You need to have target grants. If you're going to hire a grant writer, they need to be installed and given direction. You can't just say, okay, write some grants for us. So they're expensive, and they can be really ineffective if you just set them up to be like, write some grants for us. You need to have grants identified and the information kind of curated for that grant writer for them to be able to put it together and spin it in the best possible way. And what they're good at is using no acronyms, the correct words to tell the story, bring all the financial and programmatic ideas that you've put on the table concisely into an application. What they're not going to do is they're not going to go out and find grants for you. At least good ones aren't, that know how to work this. So don't look at a grant writer just hiring a grant writer for a couple $1,000s to bring in some grants based on their performance. Often what a grant writer can also bring to the table is relationship with foundations. So what people may not think is like these grants are just mindless applications to some money funnel, but realistically, if you're talking about county, city, federal, any kind of grants that you're trying to write to, they're all decided from foundations too. They're all decided by a board or individuals or a group of individuals to fund. So if you're marketing or you're out there fundraising, these connections that you make may have opportunity to allow you to come in for a grant. So don't underestimate networking and fundraising around meeting people that make decisions at a county, state, federal, or even local foundation level. Having inroads to a foundation connection and talking to them about your grant application before you submit an actual application can go really far. So in the don't side is don't just assume that these are faceless money spouts that you can just submit an application to. And we have a great application, we'll get this. I think having an open line of communication between the grantor that you're submitting the application to and the organization where they can ask questions and follow up on this instead of just submitting an application and crossing your fingers and waiting for an acceptance or a denial letter is really vital in the grant writing process.
Yeah, I'll jump in with another one. I think pre-planning is key when you're going for grants, right? Have a exploratory committee so you give yourself some time if you have a new project that you want to fund. Don't necessarily focus on the grants yet. Figure out what you want to do as an organization and then start looking for the grants that might match that up. Look at organizations and see what they have previously funded to see if it matches the project you're trying to do. Perform a cost benefit analysis so that you can figure out, is this going to be feasible? Are there grants out there that are going to be funded? And what we've discussed for weeks and weeks, budget. You need to know what your budgets are before you start the grant writing process, because the worst thing is that you get in the middle of a process and you realize this is going to be way more expensive and you've already got a grantor on the hook, and then you have to scale down your grant application, you have to scale down the project to fit the needs of what the grant is going to give you, and then it's the tail wagging the dog. So I would say pre-plan. Those who fail to plan to fail, right?
I think another big one that we haven't discussed yet is and in relation to what Mark is talking about, is making sure that you're laser focused on whatever that program you're trying to fund or the what the grant application is around. You shouldn't be too expansive. Operational grants don't come around too often, but I wouldn't try to include an operational piece in a programmatic grant that you're writing. You need to be laser focused and not trying to do too much within the grant. So if your mission is to feed, the hungry, don't also include in there, some kind of administrative, like, this will also pay for the program manager's yearly salary for all of the programs underneath that. It needs to be very narrowly defined. But also don't sell yourself short on some kind of admin allocation. Remember that needs to be built into your grant application, and that you need to come up and negotiate a reasonable indirect rate to cover all the admin functions that support that program that aren't necessarily direct expenses that are related to that program. So make sure that you build in, 10% is the rule. You can get away with 10% if you have lots of grants, but you might be able to negotiate a higher rate if you have a good open line of communication with your grantor. And if you present a case of why you need more administrative help in a grant, if there's lots of paperwork and reporting that is required with that said grant, you can ask for a higher one because that's outside the scope of the program itself. And it may take more administrative help and administrative time and effort in that program to be able to support that program correctly and achieve the outcomes. At the end of the day, you're writing a grant that's supporting outcomes of a program or an idea to serve people, and that grantor wants to make that happen. And so if you can make the case that you need more administrative help or administrative support in that program, you might be able to get a better indirect rate from that grantor in that case.
Yeah, and I'll just finish up with a few don'ts. Don't want to be too negative. We focused on a lot of the positive aspects, but some don'ts to think about. Don't try to be too cutting edge, too innovative, right? Grants are often given by foundations who tend to be a little more conservative in their giving or getting a lot of proposals. If you're doing something way out of left field and pretty wacky, you have a much slimmer chance of getting the grant because it's not going to be something they've seen before. If it's something, it's something you might want to look at venture capital for if you were in the for-profit world, but on the grant side, you're usually not getting that kind of money. So think about what fits within the grantor's portfolio, which we've already mentioned, but don't go too far out there. I would also say, don't send a lot of extras when you're giving your grant proposal. They might just be asking for a grant proposal. Don't send them the DVD and the swag for your project and all this. They're looking through lots of grant proposals, and that can tend to turn some grantors off. And I think the final point I want to make, in the immortal words of the great band Journey, don't stop believing. And with that, we end another episode of the Profitless on Purpose podcast. If you stay till the end, I truly, deeply apologize. And you can find us on Twitter at ProfitlessPod. And you can find us on the web as you found our YouTube channel. We welcome comments and we appreciate you joining us today. And we look forward to another episode of Profitless on Purpose. On behalf of Tammy, AJ, and I, have a great one.
See you, everybody.
Bye.